All right, so welcome to the Contrarians. I think we're going to call this a Contrarians Presents episode because this week we are interviewing author Martin Popoff on his most recent work of fiction, Perfect Water, and a little bit on its predecessor, Flaming Telepaths. So this is Imaginos expanded and specified, and this is the Rebel Imaginos. Now, Martin, let's start off with the basics, presuming that anybody watching this has no experience with these books at all. How would you describe, just in general, the books?
Okay, so the basics are the fact that we're talking about a kind of a Blue Oyster Cult song suite. And this whole Imaginos saga was something that Sandy Pearlman, who became their manager and one of the many great lyricists in this band and producer, this is something he came up with in about 1967, based on a lot of his sort of interests in science and UFOs and the occult and Lovecraft and all this. So it's sort of this set of lyrics that the band would go back to the well every once in a while. As Joe describes it, it was a binder sitting on the amp kind of thing. And along the way, they drop down and have, I don't know, depending on how you count, a dozen songs that are linked to this Imaginos saga. And essentially the way Sandy explained it, and most of them are front end loaded, although not all of them. Some of them show up later on, kind of thing as well. As Sandy kind of explained it, because it is fairly opaque and there's really not a lot of words, hence the major jumping off point to spin two books out of interpreting what Sandy might have meant in this whole thing. But essentially the story is of this being that is born in human form, off of something like Lay Invisibles, the old ones. They're a bit like Lovecraft's big scary fish.
Right.
And from alien origin and all this, and he has kind of magic powers and can shapeshift and stuff. And essentially, he shows up at various human conflicts. And one of the tossed off things Sandy said, which causes this big jumping off point, is that it's a story that attempts to explain the occult origins of World War I. Right.
Right.
So the problem is there really aren't in real human history, there aren't really that many occult origins of World War One. There's a lot more occult related with World War II. And Albert and myself, Albert Bouchard. So number one, Albert is the guy in the band who was most interested in Sandy's story. And essentially what happened is that, starting in around 1982, when Albert was ousted from the band, he said, I'm going to really pick up and I'm going to drive this Imaginos story home, sort of thing. So starting then, he got together with Sandy, and the idea was, let's do a double album of this and do it properly and take all the Imaginos songs and anything that we can loosely relate to it and then add to it. And let's make this massive Imaginos album that once and for all is this great concept album. It didn't happen, except in 1988, we got a single album version of it, which is considered, as they say in the UK, a bit of a dog's breakfast. The productions are kind of up and down all over the place. There's guest stars all over it. It's very fragmented, and then even fragmented further because Sandy says it's what does he call it? A random access story. So Columbia went and moved the tracks around, so it doesn't even fit what is already a bit of a complicated story in terms of chronology. So there is this one album. It's kind of harshly recorded. It's kind of heavy. It reprises some old songs, so it's kind of a mess. It's got some really goofy sort of, boppy poppy music on it mixed with this heavy stuff, and nobody really likes it very much. So Albert eventually later on goes and starts making these Imaginos albums, and he does it in kind of a stripped down acoustic form. He's singing on them, but he's essentially picked up the whole thing, and there's a comic book now related. So what I've done with these books is Well, I'll leave it there. That's I'm answering your question at that point.
Right. Okay. So it does bring a follow-up question just in general. Like you say, there's only about 6 songs in the BOC catalog, not including the Imaginos album now, but up to that. So the entire history of the band, half a dozen songs loosely tied to Imaginos. So why is that such a fascinating thing for BOC fans that years later in 2021, you would write an entire book expanding on that storyline?
Yeah, I think it's because it is an interesting story. The idea that he shows up at these different conflicts, and then it kind of, you can stretch it into World War II because the band, I guess this is what happens here. So there aren't a lot that are directly related, but the poetry in them is so dense that you can pull out so many cool things from them. It's really bizarre. There's a lot of alchemy and John Dee in there, and the Magna of Illusion, and then they stick the Cliff House on the front cover of the of the Imaginos album. So I jump off of that and tie in all sorts of Cliff House things and the Sutro baths and everything into it, and the Led Zeppelin, the object I put in there as well, because it's kind of like Led Zeppelin's Magna of Illusion, or Led Zeppelin's John Dee Shoe Stone, which is a black mirror that you can look in and see angels and various things and predict the future and all this stuff. But I guess it's an interesting question, because I guess also what happens is it almost feels like many of the rest of the Blue Oyster Cult lyrics, it's like the lyricists grab this Imaginos concept and egg themselves on to have things that might have echoes of or reverberations of the story. And then also what happens is Blue Oyster Cult, they do have a little bit of kind of a World War II vibe as well with them, and they love their biker gangs and conspiracy theories and UFO stuff, because this has a UFO thing. So you could take all the future kind of UFO references and fold it into the story as well. And that's kind of what I did with these books. I related all sorts of historical events because that was the idea, right? So it's almost like there's almost like more nonfiction in these books than there is fiction, because everything starts with real world human events. So it's a long series of timeline things going back to ancient times, and Atlantis and Edgar Cayce and the Two-Eye Stone and all this stuff, and who built the pyramids and all that kind of stuff. Right up to the modern era. There's a lot of Soviet and Russian stuff in here because I'm kind of fascinated with this concept of Russian cosmism. So that's all in here as well. There's the Kennedy assassination stuff. There's the UFO file, UFO cover-up stuff, Men in Black. But what I liked about this process is that so it starts with a timeline event, and then I relate it to Blue Oyster Cult lyrics. So as it moves on, each entry moves on, the fiction comes out in it, right? Or first the what did Blue Oyster Cult really mean with this whole thing, or what did Sandy mean and this stepping off point? And the other point I want to make that makes it more exciting to me than just calling it fiction is people are so invested in the H.P. Lovecraft, Cthulhu mythos and all that stuff, where people have posited that like Kenneth Grant, like famous occultists and stuff, have posited that maybe he was because he's a famous materialist, atheist, doesn't believe in magic and stuff, right? He's right. A science-based guy. Kenneth Grant would say, well, maybe Lovecraft, which was channeling truisms in his dreams when he'd have these disturbing dreams and come up with these stories. That's one thing. And then the other thing is the idea of the egregore, where if somebody makes a piece of art, like I write these books or whatever, if somebody puts this down and puts art out into the world, and a whole bunch of people ponder it or talk about it, or think about it or believe it, can there be like a collective consciousness that makes this real, right? That turns these things and actually adds it to human history in a real form. So it's speculative nonfiction. So it starts, like I say, there's a massive base of nonfiction that kicks everything off, and then takes it to a fictional place, and takes it to, essentially what those two books are at 500 pages, pretty much, or more than that, or something around there, 450. What it does is it expands the possibility of the Imaginos story in much the same tradition that there have been many, many writers who have expanded Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos and added to it, and turned into whole series as you move on. So Sandy was doing that already with that. I just the other day, Saturday, Albert emailed me and said, "Hey, Martin, have you heard about this book, the Morning of the Magicians?" Right, and it turns out that there's this book that was written in 1960 by these two French guys that covers a lot of these themes as well. And it's a little bit like Albert is now just newly discovering that Sandy was somewhat inspired by that as well. Sandy was a very literate guy. He's a professor and all this, and fascinating interview. In fact, so much of what we know about Imaginos a lot of it comes from even my own interviews with Sandy, where you coax more of the story out of him in interview form, right? Which adds to the lyrics, which is kind of cool. So that's all in my old Bluish Occult book. But so there's a whole tradition going back where all this stuff gets inspired by, and where it ends up in these two books.
Okay. So we're going to revisit a lot of that as we go through this. Okay. I'm going to try and keep myself a little more structured here. When you were doing these historical digressions, and for anybody who doesn't own a copy of, I keep holding up the old one, anyone who doesn't own a copy of Perfect Water or Flaming Telepaths, and they do very much go together, although you don't technically have to read Flaming Telepaths first. It'll help. It is set up in a timeline where you've got a time generally always based around a real historical event or a historical person. Mm-hmm. So as I was reading, I wondered, how much of this are you researching during the writing process, and how much of it did you have kind of an idea in mind and then you went back to find something to fit the idea?
Interesting. So one of the neat things about writing a book like this is you can follow a thread, and you can just pop things into place on the timeline. So that's really great. You don't have to think about where to go with something. You see a date, you go to that area in your Word doc and start building it that way. So that's really cool. So no, it was, I guess in the realm of idea generation. Like, there's one thing I wanted to do with these books that I think it does succeed in doing is there is enough on every single page to send you down like a half dozen to 20 rabbit holes. The entries are so dense with concepts, and some of the entries kind of they're just sitting there and they end with that historical entry, and I don't go out of my way to relate it to anything occult or UFO-ish or Blue Oyster cultish, right? Right. So some of them are designed to just sit there and make you think. Same way with the pictures. As I explained in the front of the book, the pictures follow the Robert Plant song title concept, where with Robert Plant, many of the song titles are just, that's like extra real estate to keep writing the song. And he'll say something, he'll call a song Big Log, and you go, what is that all about, right? It's got nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
And so the pictures add to it, where you look at the picture and they may, in a lot of cases, not relate particularly well to anything else, but they're just added things for you to sort of think about, right? But the other cool thing about the timeline thing, and this is why I love doing this, and there's an example I wanted to point out that's just a simple sort of example that explains this idea. And I'll read it in a sec. But so the concept is that as you're building something in a timeline form, and you have all these multiple layers of rabbit holes, whether it's Edgar Cayce, Wizard of Oz, the lyrics of the Stranglers, alchemy, the Kennedy assassination, Cuba, the hot zone, the pyramids. As you're building all these different layers and you're following various explorers through time, like the Plongeons, and even John Lennon and Yoko going to Egypt on a mysterious trip in 1979. As you're building all this in the timelines, you eventually start seeing things happening on the same date sometimes, and you start relating that stuff together, and or on the same date 100 years later or whatever, right?
Right.
So an example of that, which is quite amusing, is like the entry for August 5th, 1957 reads, American bandstand debuts, and Vladimir Peregudov designs Soviet Russia's first nuclear-powered submarine. Constructed in Molodovsk, the vessel is named K3. Later on September 8th, 1967, fire breaks out on board the submarine. 39 crew members died. There's a lot of fire throughout this book, too. A lot of relations to fire. Hurricanes, fires, Aleister Crowley being his trips. I think I might be one of the first people who's discovered by mapping where Aleister Crowley travels, how calamity follows him everywhere. It's kind of interesting.
Okay.
And then Sandy writes the Imaginos saga in 1967, paranormally fanned by the flames and possessed by the ghosts of the crew. So that's me just poetically saying, Sandy's writing this story in 1967. By the way, there's a nuclear fire on a Soviet sub that kills 39 people. Sandy is influenced by this. Not remotely correct, but I just say it, right?
Right.
And then the vessel will be decommissioned in 1988, the year the Imaginos record is issued. The album effectively replacing the submarine. It becomes part of the Naval Glory Museum in Kronstadt on August 2nd, 2023, which is 4 days after Albert Bouchard issues Imaginos 3 Mutant Formation. So a whole bunch of unrelated things. This takes up like a quarter of one page of 250 pages, right?
Right.
Yet we're linking 1957 to two events in 1967, to two more events in 1988, to two events in 2023, all like causing a Carl Jung synchronicity, chaos magic weirdness between this nuclear sub and Sandy's Imaginos story, and the Imaginos album in 88, and another Imaginos album in 2023. It takes up no space. It's kind of a mind blower. But the idea is that every page is full of stuff like that.
Right. And even I think that speaks to the nature of conspiracy theories. Scientists now say humans are kind of programmed to look for conspiracies because we follow threads like you're doing in your book. We look for causation and correlation even when there's not any. So this style of writing where you've got the little nuggets separated by the timelines, it reminds me a lot of the Burroughs cut-up method, in our world most famously used by David Bowie to write his lyrics, where you get less of a narration and more your mind starts to pick out themes. Yeah. And that's what sticks with you. So after reading Flaming Telepaths, what I got out of this was that the theme is about the artist creating magic through art.
Yes.
Then, as we move into Perfect Water, and I love this, we go down a layer. So we've moved from the artist. This book's about the audience. The audience then taking in art, and you were just talking about the egregore, and then affecting reality because they viewed this art. So we have top layer, bottom layer.
Interesting, yeah.
So... That's cool. Is any of that intentional, or does that just organically come out of the story?
Yeah, that's interesting. To address your first point, so there's really cool things that so let me see if I can relate this one point. Okay, I went on the Walter Bosley channel and we talked about this, and Walter brought up an interesting thing that Dr. Joseph Farrell brought up, how when there was when they were nuclear testing, there was like how did he explain it? The explosion, the sound, and then there was a third entity, right? And that third entity really almost serves as a metaphor for what happens throughout these books, because the third entity is almost like it's almost like the extra being or the extra art that's created when you hang on. Let me think of it this way. Okay, so the third entity is somewhat like the tear in the psychic fabric. Now, this is actually going to get to the plot of this book, because there is kind of a more of a pronounced plot even than in the first one, because I solicited a bunch of feedback from readers from the first one, and a lot of people said it was too hard to follow, right?
Okay.
And that doesn't mean it's deep. It just means that I really should have tied things together better, right? So I'm tying things together better here. So this idea of the tear in the psychic fabric is really important here, because the plot of this book is more or less Imaginos wants to get out of doing what he was bid to do in World War I and say the Civil War and maybe the Spanish Civil War in World War II. So what he's trying to do is he is trying to escape the bidding of the old ones and get back to his ancestral planet, which he's never actually been to because he was born on Earth. You know, the oyster boys are swimming for me now and all this, washed up on shore, blah, blah, blah. Born in New Hampshire and all this kind of thing. He was like birthed or molded into clay, molded into human clay, to quote Creed, but made here by aliens
right.
who live here, right, under the oceans. And the whole ocean thing and tunnels in Atlantis is another rabbit hole throughout this book. But so his idea is, through the combination of he's trying to create a tear in the psychic fabric, more like an interstellar superhighway, to be able to, grease his trip off of Earth back to his planet. And the way he's doing this, and why there's so many disciplines throughout this book, is he's doing it through inspiration from art, inspiration from occult magic, inspiration from earthly science. There's a lot of earthly science in here, and inspiration from alien science, right? So he's looking at it's more or less like a three-pillared approach between the occult and two forms of science, where he's saying, if I can build this stool properly, I can build a spaceship to fly me home, essentially. So that's right. Why he shows up and he does his shape shifting and possesses the souls of various occultists and scientists throughout this whole thing, because he's looking for, he's essentially looking for a cab ride off this planet, so he doesn't have to keep causing himself PTSD by killing humans in massive conflicts all the time. So that's more or less the plot of the thing.
Right. And I want to address that just a little bit more, because, of course, in Flaming Telepaths, it's all about the occult origins of World War I. So we move, although there is material before that, tying in Atlantis and these other narratives, we have moved past World War I, and yet now, even in the 20th and 21st centuries, which certainly have enough evil things to go around that Imaginos could have inspired, but he's no longer the Satan figure. He's no longer testing people. He just wants to get home. So why the switch in Imaginos's motivation here? Well, because that's yours, right? That's your idea that he wants to go.
I would say so. But one of the funny things that happens is that it almost feels like, and this feels like creative divinity of some sort, or searching and finding the correct answer. If you search long enough, you will get the correct answer. Because weirdly enough, Albert kind of arrived at the same thing. Albert kind of moves the story in this way as well. And I wonder if it's somewhat the same idea, because I have a very practical reason that I moved the story in that direction, right? Two practical reasons. One, I wanted this book to be greatly themed on aliens. Two, I wanted this book not to be a massive book about Nazis, right? Right. I didn't want the whole thing to be filled with Nazi characters. There's enough of them in there anyways, right? There's a lot of that, because, but more related to just like Die Glocke, the Nazi Bell technology and all this sort of stuff. And then those the Nazis building the German rocket program, ending up in America with Operation Paperclip and all that crazy stuff that Annie talks about, that great book she did about, and how the Soviets were trying to get a bunch of them as well. And then also the Russian cosmism thing going forward as well, which I could get into. But so essentially, it was a practicality that I didn't want this thing to just be, because Sandy doesn't really take it there either. Because it would almost be a repeat of the first one, and he did explicitly say World War I, right? So I didn't want the whole book to be this book about Nazis, right? I wanted to, and I love the way that so many Blue Oyster Cult lyrics tie into the whole alien technology thing, anyways, right?
Right.
And it allowed me to create this timeline forward. And you're right, to address a point. So the first book is lots of historical stuff, a lot of 1800s and 1700s leading up, and then I have an appendix after World War I in the first one. This one is almost entirely later, but there's a lot there's a lot of preamble stuff, but all the preamble stuff that goes back in time before World War I is related to like dozens and dozens of rabbit hole threads that relate to concepts that are, unique to this book, more or less, or were just in the appendix of the old one. So there's a lot of Alice in Wonderland and Wizard of Oz stuff in here, and the various scientists and Le Plongeon and a lot of Edgar Cayce and again, pyramids and stuff like that. Yeah, I'll stop there. You throw me
okay.
Yeah.
So the and let's explore the rabbit hole here for a second, because if anybody has not read these, some of these entries are like a fever dream of historical with complete and utter nonsense, but stated in such a way that you can just passively absorb it, and you're like, okay, that makes sense. And if you think about it, you're like, what are you talking about? That guy did not invent the Brown sound. What the hell?
Exactly.
It's almost, I mean, hopefully this isn't an insulting term, but it's almost like outsider art. If anybody knows that concept.
Yeah.
So some of the things in the book, actually, there's a lot of comedy in the second one, which I did not really expect. Comedy may be the wrong word. There's a lot of amusing things in it. Right. And my favorite things that you do are the things that are not directly Blue Oyster Cult inspired, because I feel like that's the easy part. And you're throwing in a lot of Blue Oyster Cult lyrics, and when this happens, it's talked about in this song. Yep. And sometimes I'm like, I don't know that I buy that. But my favorite parts actually started in the appendix in Flaming Telepaths, where you talk about the Grateful Dead and the Doors.
Yeah. And
then in Perfect Water, we've moved on from the Grateful Dead and the Doors, and you've already mentioned these, but you didn't mention Kiss. You tie in Kiss, you tie in the Stranglers, you've got John and Yoko. So still very much a lot of musical things being included with Blue Oyster Cult. But I kept going, why the Stranglers? Because, and maybe this would have been too obvious, but I would have expected you to go with the Damned. And the Stranglers seemed like a weird, I don't know why you picked that band.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Stranglers.
Yeah. Well, to explain, and I don't know if there's a lot of Stranglers. I mean, we get to the 80s or whatever, and there's some Stranglers albums, and Stranglers gets mentioned over the course of 3 or 4 pages or whatever, right? Kind of thing. But yes, I mean, I dropped down on it a bunch of times. To answer your question, they have this amazing, cool album that, I still have my UK copy, called The Gospel According to the Men in Black, right? And the gatefold of it is this beautiful picture of the Last Supper with a couple of, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, looking Men in Black guys leaning over Jesus, right? Like really airbrushed in there really nicely. It's really cool. And then they have the Raven, where they talk about some of this stuff. So the Stranglers have some truly really cool, spooky lyrics. And they're kind of like a spooky post-punk version of Blue Oyster Cult in a way. There's just a spirit about them that's kind of there, right? The John and Yoko thing's kind of interesting. So I mentioned a couple things about that. So there's a few pages that go on about Le Plongeon and his wife in the early 1900s, and they're exploring the Yucatan. There's a lot of Yucatan and Process Church and the Hot Zone and Crowley traveling to Mexico. And, in one of my illustrations in the first one is the Hotel Iturbe, I guess it's called, where he stayed, and he climbs mountains and all this stuff. So there's a lot of like dropping down on places all over the place, telluric currents, earthquakes, cave systems. I don't know how much I go into the cave stuff. That could be a future one. But Atlantis, Loch Ness, Boleskine House, how these underwater beings can maybe move through these various points. But to get back to John and Yoko, so there's this love story between Le Plongeon and his wife. I can't remember what her name is, but they're both explorers. They're both super into this stuff. Well, John and Yoko actually go to Egypt, and there's this kind of weird clandestine trip they do in 1979. And this brings up an interesting point. There's one very creepy picture I drew in here where, so I used a tiny bit of old school AI back when there was that. Do you remember about a year and a half ago, there was this crazy story about this Loab creature. This again, it gets back to the third element, right? How there was this kind of personality, this creepy woman that emerged when you did this person did these prompts, and then said, okay, give me the opposite of that, etc. And there was kind of like this demonic personality thing that came out of it. And so I used a little bit of early creepy AI to generate some concepts of things I might draw pictures from, because I did about 40 illustrations in here, right? And I also used a tiny bit of AI using character AI, thinking, what if I created characters like Sandy, who is sadly no longer with us, who can talk again, or Austin Osman Spare talking, or Imaginos himself talking, right? So I did a whole bunch of crazy prompting, and I would get tons of stuff that was pretty boring, right? But if I saw something interesting, I would say, I'm going to use that. And then I'll embellish a little bit as well, right? But it's like AI kind of inspired me a little. Like, all of a sudden, Imaginos is talking. He mentions this character called Dr. Space. It's like, well, that's interesting. Where did that come from, right? And then he wears a red robe and all this stuff. It's like, what? Like, so I got to put that guy in here, right? Or Sandy, I'd ask Sandy, what are some alternate song titles you almost put on the first Blue Oyster Cult album? And then he'd give me, and then AI would give me like 10 song titles, right? And I'm going, these are all cheesy, but I like that one. I'll mention that one, right?
Right.
But, so just to wrap up, so there's this one creepy picture that I drew that combines the face of Yoko and John standing, and they're not, I didn't even put them in front of pyramids just to make it different, but that combine the two. And I thought, I got to draw that. That is really creeping me out, right? And they're standing next to this guy who looks like a very real person that I don't know who that is, right? It's like, is this like some sort of third element standing next to a combined John and Yoko? And I just put them in there. I didn't explain it. Although people who buy, I made 8.5 by 11 prints of these, and like the first one. And if anybody orders any of these prints from me, I send them an image key, which is the explanation of what all the pictures mean. So that thing goes out with any order of the print. So it's explained in there. But I just thought that one really creeped me out, and I didn't know if I was going to include it or not. But I love the idea how it's like a metaphor for John and Yoko's romance, and also the Plongeon's romance of these explorers who did similar exploring, I guess. And then John, it's rumored that Yoko brought some stuff back from there, and it was cursed, and things from the Egyptian thing. So yeah, there's a lot of this Jungian extra third element thing, and then this third element of the old school AI, which seems to be gone now. That personality has left the building, and it's gotten a little bit boring. So, right,
okay, and man, you just went over a bunch of stuff that I was going to ask about. So we're going to get back to some of that as we go.
Okay.
Anybody who doesn't know, Martin is a graphic artist. He did all of the illustrations in these. And if you follow him on Facebook. He puts up drawings he's done. What do you call them? Crayon pencil on
Yeah,
black
I do
backgrounds.
these
And
rock star ones, and I do these fake
yeah,
ads. But these ones are all just pencil on white. They're all made to look old timey because I
so let me
both of
just
these books. Yeah, that's the John and Yoko. That's the John and Yoko combined one next to a guy I don't know who that is. You know who that looks a little bit like?
wait, is that really it? Because I
Yes,
literally just picked this one at random, and it
that is
happened
the
to be the
one.
one we were just talking
That
about.
is the one. That is
So,
weird. Yeah. But you know who that guy looks like standing next to him? It looks a little bit like Aubrey Powell from Hypnosis, which is kind of weird. It's got a little bit, and why I don't know. So that's another creepy thing, right? But
okay.
yeah, so the idea is with both of these books, the whole design of them and them being on kind of like thicker cream colored paper and the font I picked, and how all the pictures are rendered by my awesome layout guy Eduardo with the border and stuff, and you know everything's made to look kind of old timey because I wanted the whole series, you know, of these to have that old timey steampunk old parchment kind of feel, like these are weird undiscovered drawings from the past kind of thing, right?
Right. So, which came first, the writing or the pictures?
Oh man, Reed, I got to tell you, to make myself finish these damn projects, it went hand in hand, and I would draw. I would go, man, I've been working on this book for 2 months. I got to get some drawings done, right? And I would just stop and I would do 3 drawings. I go, okay, that was a good weekend. I got 3 drawings done, right? And it's like the one was propelling me to get finished with the other, and then it's going, okay, I'm up to 30 drawings. I actually am going to finish this book, right? So now I
Right.
just kind of get, and that made me keep writing. It took a long time, right, to do these, right? But I'm glad it got done. So I think there's 39 in the first one and 40 in the second one or something. In the first one, I threw in one of my tossed off Blue Oyster Cult van drawings at the end, which doesn't really relate to anything. But yeah, so there's about 80 combined between the two, and they're all pastiches of literally old things mixed with this. Like I say, this one has some of them have, like, I love that old school face scarring thing that AI would do, which again
Right.
seems to be gone, and I used a little bit of that in there as well. So there's things like behind that picture, Marjorie Cameron on the wall. That's give me the blah 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 in the style of Aubrey Beardsley. And so that's like a crazy AI Aubrey Beardsley just thing I stuck on the wall behind Marjorie Cameron, right? So yeah, there's definitely a lot of weirdness in there in the pictures, but like I say, that's all explained in the image key thing.
Very interesting. Okay, and we have got, oh, pardon me, we have got to talk a little bit more about the AI characters.
Mm-hmm.
So, because you say in your foreword, just like you already explained, that you tried to do the AI, and of course, everybody should know that an AI is not a true AI. It's what they call an LLM, a large language modeler. They don't actually think, create new thoughts.
Yeah.
It's a deep subject, and I'm not a scientist, so we'll just leave it at that. But in any case, you mentioned that most of what they give you didn't work. It was just boring.
Yeah.
But that having said, after I read that forward and then got into the story, I was surprised at how often things are attributed to AI Sandy Pearlman or AI Imaginos.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me, so at that point, as the reader, I'm going, well, wait, what came from AI and what comes from Martin? I mean, the writing style, again, that fever dream writing style, you really can't tell what's your thought and what might have been computer generated. But the thing that absolutely stood out to me is Dr. Space, because you're reading through this thing and suddenly it goes, well, the story's really about Dr. Space. And you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Dr. Space, who the hell is that? And, you know, I have not read recently all of the Blue Oyster Cult lyrics, but it's like, I don't remember anything called Dr. Space. So that was kicked out by the AI.
Yes. And so a couple of cool things. So you're right. The process was, I was essentially mostly bored by what AI was coming up with, and very upset and like, okay, this is not good. That I'm wasting a lot of time at this. But then the odd gem would come out, kind of thing, right? But the other neat thing that I realize now about the AI entries in here, and there's not a lot. I mean, essentially, it's supporting stuff for an entry. It might be AI. As I say, I just put AISP or AI AOS, Austin Osman Spare, or AI which is AI Imaginos speaking or whatever. But one thing I did notice, it actually was sort of a calming influence and a lowering of the franticness, because sometimes those AI explanations, if they're a little vanilla, they actually anchor it and they talk in more normal terms and help underscore what the story is throughout. It's like a very, very calm sort of explanation of what I'm getting at here. I don't know if I could find anything like that, but what do we got here? Okay, so here's one. April 25th, 1919. I didn't even bookmark this one. I've just opened the page, right? The Bauhaus movement is established in Weimar, Germany. Art and design, a subset of science, merge, creating one of many Richter blips of synergies between Imaginos recognized disciplines. AISP says, so this is AI Sandy Perlman, the Bauhaus movement provided the designs and the blueprints for the German space program's rocket and space capsules. Their influence can also be seen in the Gallic designed Golden Dawn temple, right? So here I'm saying I just brought Gallic into it because Gallic is the mysterious person who designed the album cover of the first album and Tyranny and Mutation. But I go through, like when you get to these, I draw this whole thing about how it's a Golden Dawn temple that he's drawing, and there's energy coming out of the top and all this sort of stuff, radio waves and everything. So there's a perfect example of just literally just okay. So and then the next thing says, artificial and AI Austin Osman Spare. The Bauhaus movement was interested in exploring the relationship between art and science. Their motto was art and technology and new unity, which is an interesting and unique ideology and is reflected in the ways in which many occultists and magicians in the modern era have tried to merge science and mysticism. I think that the Bauhaus movement has a lot of similarities with chaos magic, as they are both interested in exploring emerging different realms of knowledge. So I can't remember how much of that is me or AI, but it's fascinating to me that he doesn't say anything about Imaginos or Blue Oyster Cult, but he's underpinning or underscoring or emphasizing the marriage between magic and art and design, which is one of the main themes of the book. Imaginos needs art and the occult and design and science to be able to build this spaceship out of here.
And I noticed that Sandy Perlman has moved from being the generator of the idea in Flaming Telepath. He's an active character in Perfect Water, where you have Sandy Perlman manipulating events to try and affect society through loud rock music. And was that something that came from having him as a character in the book through the AI?
Well, I would say the main function of him in there and the other AI characters is as a narrator or as, Sandy, it's funny. So I guess I've never really thought about this, but I guess what Sandy is doing is validating all my crazy arguments page by page by page, although he's not in there a lot. Like I say, the AI really isn't in there a lot. But when it is, he's basically validating this crazy point of drawing, these connections between something. He's saying, yes, Martin, you're right about that, right? And he's coming back from the dead and saying this, right? And I wanted these guys in here also to also serve as the metaphor of this idea that, maybe AI is able to channel the spirits of these people and have them speak again. Maybe AI is going to be a new way, because we know it is literally a new way to for the next 300 years, Tom Cruise can do commercials if he wants, right? So it's a way to almost like scarily have these guys talking throughout this book, even though they're no longer with us. And Imaginos never even really existed, or did he, kind of thing, right?
Right. So, and that again, That is one of the most meta things I think I have ever experienced in a book, because it's your process of writing the book is recreating the theme of the book, with the artist impacting the real world and then the reader changing the real world because of what they read. I mean, the whole thing is very deep. If you start following it, it really is a mind blower. So I do want to point out that before you started the sequel, you had exchanged emails with me and probably a lot of other people talking about whether you wanted to do a second book. And I remember you said you don't want to do a full book of Nazis, but you're going to go, you really want to concentrate on UFOs, Altamont, and bikers. So when I was reading this, I kept looking for Altamont and bikers, and you did not really include those. I was like, oh, come on, man. Where's my Altamont and bikers?
Yeah,
I thought
right.
Imaginos kicked off Altamont.
There isn't much bikers in there aren't many bikers in it, because I didn't find a lot in the Bluish Occult lyrics. And I also thought in the back of my mind, if I start saying a lot of specific things about a lot of bikers, I might get in trouble with the bikers, right? So I kind of stayed away from that a little bit as well. But we know in Bluish Occult, I mean, biker stories, we got Golden Age of Leather, we got a little bit of Shadow of California, a little bit on Revolution by Night. It's not particularly much in there anyways. But yes, there is definitely a lot of UFO stuff. And I love the idea of introducing people to Russian cosmism, because a lot of people don't even know about this. But so what I loved about how cosmism works to this, first of all, what it is there's this theory of Fyodorov. He's a mild-mannered, very eccentric librarian in Russia in the 1800s kind of thing, right? And it's this theory that bringing Jesus back from the dead is not nearly enough of a big project. What we need to do, to be a true Christian, we need to bring everybody who has ever died back from the dead. And it's like, but this is a big project. And we're also going to need to build spaceships that can scoop up all the cosmic dust of the entire universe, because a lot of people are basically cosmic dust floating around in the universe. We have to scoop all that up, bring them all back, rejuvenate everybody who has ever lived. But then we have a new problem. If we can solve that one, because part of the Russian soul is this idea of what is to be done, right? That's referenced in here a little bit as well. I'm fascinated by the whole idea of the Russian soul, right? But what is to be done? And sometimes it's almost like pick the biggest thing, because it's absolutely impossible, and we can, distract ourselves for our whole life working on these big projects, right? So once you scoop up all the dust of the universe and bring it back and rejuvenate everybody who's ever lived, there is not enough room on Earth for everybody. So now we're going to have to populate every other planet in the universe with all these new zombies, these old people brought back to life. So the funny thing and how it relates, because I do a lot of relating in here. You know how I mentioned the pillars of the occult and alien science and earthly science, but another pillar is art. And that's why there's Austin Osman Spare and various artists, because art is chaos magic in itself, and it's playing God itself, and it's creating something that wasn't there itself, and all that stuff, blah, blah, blah. The third thing, Carl Jung, all that, synchronicities. So the funny thing, how cosmism relates to that is, it's such a crazy, weird idea. People say Russia doesn't have a philosophy. Their philosophy comes out in their literature, right? But this is almost like a philosophy, and it's such a religious philosophy too. But it also like somewhat inspired the Russian space program, right? So you start seeing people go, oh, I read about Führer or talked about cosmism. We should figure out how to shoot rockets into the sky, and let's see how high they can go and stuff. And scientists started doing math and stuff and working that out. So it's weird. It has this roots in this craziness and roots in the Russian soul, but so all along in this book, you get recurring the Russian program coming up, the German program, the American program, and again, all of that is part of what hopefully Imaginos, or one thing that might be helpful for him to build the spaceship to take off.
Right. Okay. And in a way, this is the same thing that you get. Now, this is not part of the Imaginos narrative, but the cyberpunk authors of the mid 80s influencing the creation of the internet. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, that's more layers to look at as well. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't go too much into the. I can't remember what I did in here, Reed. Frankly, so much of it is so long ago. I'm opening it. I'm seeing the SETI stuff. I'm seeing
yeah.
Hyperboreans, Dogman, Sirius, the Star.
Oh, let me ask real quick about because I anybody if it feels like we're kind of jumping around, we're trying to keep it as organized as we can. But one more thing that came out of the AI Sandy Pearlman, and because I'm never knowing whether it's a seed generated by the computer coming from you, at one point, AI Sandy Pearlman, I had to take notes on this because it's we go all the way back. We leave the idea of Imaginos as the person and go back to Gil Blanco County relating to Gilgamesh, the Babylonian hero, and how the Hyperboreans create a black sword named Imaginos, which then travels through the ages with different governments attempting to take hold of Imaginos for evil purposes. And I thought that is such a wonderful little fantasy narrative. And we're only talking about 2 paragraphs here. This is the depth of ideas that come. So this whole thing about Gilgamesh and a sword named Imaginos and the Hyperboreans, is that you or is that AI?
It is so weird. I'm sitting here looking at the book and I opened to that exact page. It's so bizarre. We've both done that now. It's really weird. And I'd forgotten I had done any of this. I'll just read a little bit of this one. So, end of 82, the demo tape for the first record of the Imaginos trilogy is completed. For composition from the demo will not make the eventual record. These are Gil Blanco County, The Girl That Love Made Blind, Blue Oyster Cult. And throughout this, you're really going to get an idea of the whole Imaginos thing. I mean, between these 2 books, everything related to Imaginos is explained to true reality. Let's see. AISP says, the title Gil Blanco County is a reference to Gilgamesh, who figures in an alternate version of the Imaginos saga that begins much earlier. Here's roughly how I had that mapped out. 4000 BCE, the Hyperboreans, an ancient race of Atlantean-like people, develop advanced technology, including the creation of a sentient, malevolent black sword. I can't believe this is the exact same page. That's bizarre. Because I thought you're explaining this. A, I'm going, I don't remember doing this. And B, it's probably at the beginning of the book because you're talking ancient history. But no, it's near the end of the book, right? Imagine 1900 BCE, the Hyperboreans used the Imaginos to conquer and dominate other civilizations, including the ancient city of Babylon. And then in brackets, I put astronomy. 7000 BCE, a Babylonian sage named Gilgamesh seeks to defame the Hyperboreans and their dark weapon, Gil Blanco County. 30 CE, the Roman Empire discovers the ruins of Hyperborea and the Imaginos and attempts to harness its power for their own ends, Black Blade. 1095 CE, the Crusaders seek the Imaginos, which they believe will help them conquer Jerusalem, the siege and investiture of Baron von Frankenstein's castle at Wissaria. So, yeah, you're right. It's all in here. And the whole idea of the blacks, because Blush has a song called Black Blade. They got the Magna of Illusion, John Dee's Shoestone. It's a mirror, the Black Mirror. We've got Edgar Case with the Two Eye Stone, Free Energy, which goes into Peter Menace and the soup that is part of the Sonoro Aero Club and the Victorian Airship Mystery. That's all in here as well. But also, this all relates to me greatly to Led Zeppelin's The Object on Presence. I mean, to me, that is literally this thing. And I've drawn it into some of the pictures here. In the old book, in the Flaming Telepaths book, one of my favorite pictures, and Albert actually used this in one of his videos, Imaginos videos off the first album. In the video, it's the picture where the Sutro Baths has burnt to the ground next to the Cliff House. And in its place is a large Led Zeppelin, The Object, right?
Right. I remember.
So, there's all this alchemy stuff about what happens when you burn things, the hardness of diamond and carbon and heavy metal, the black and silver, all this, because Sandy was greatly into the whole alchemy thing. So, the fact of the matter is, this is another example where half of Sandy's references to alchemy don't have anything to do with the Imaginos story, and half of the references do. So yeah, there's all that. But you're right. That's another example of something I'd completely forgotten about that I put in there that you can make a whole book around. So every single page is like I say, designed to make you dizzy.
Right. Okay. Well, I promised we weren't going to go an hour and a half. That's about 50 minutes. Everybody, if this chat has not made you curious enough to read these books, then these books are not meant for you, because this is the experience that you get from reading them. And I assure you, we are just scratching the surface of what is on these books. So if this sounds like, if you watched this video and went, well, that sounds interesting, check out the books. They are well worth your investment of time. So, Martin, thank you very much for agreeing to chat with me this morning. I don't know what we've learned, but it was all great stuff.
Good, yeah. Well, thanks for tackling them, Reed. That's amazing that you would go into these like this. And yeah, great questions too. Yeah.
All right, so everyone, listen to some Blue Oyster Cult. If you don't, why don't kids read today? Sorry, that's a different rant. Check out these books, and we'll see you on another Contrarians video very soon.